So a little bit about me. I'm a cloud architect at xMatters. I've been here about 3 years prior to this role, which I just started in the last month. I was an operations engineer, so working in our ops group, mostly focused on our colo infrastructure when I started, and then we've gone through a big migration into Google Cloud since then. So I've been part of that through the whole process, which was really interesting. Our headquarters is in San Ramon, California. We have engineering offices in Vancouver, BC, and Victoria. So I live and work in Victoria. Anyone familiar with Victoria? Been there? Know where it is?
Yeah. Family in Vancouver.
Oh, very good.
How close is it to
it is, so it's on Vancouver Island, which is just offshore from Vancouver, and it's at the very southern tip of that. It's at the mouth of Puget Sound, basically. Yeah. My background is in Python, PostgreSQL, and healthcare software. Prior to being at xMatters, I was at a not-for-profit for 9 years where we built medical record software that had a lot of integration with Cerner. Because this is my first time in Texas, I feel it necessary to mention that I grew up in Houston, but not the one you're thinking of. If you look at that blue dot way up there, just about to the same latitude as the south end of the Alaska Panhandle, that is Houston, BC, population 4,000 people. So despite not having an accent to go with it, anytime I tell anyone anywhere that I came from Houston, they say, "Oh, Texas?" And then they're always disappointed when I say no. Another thing that I noted coming from, Victoria is right here, south end of Vancouver Island. It was colder here today than it was at home in Victoria, which I was surprised to find. So if anyone is done with your frigid Texas winter, come to Canada. It's a tropical paradise, as you can see. Okay, so small group, but I'm going to take some polls anyway. How many of you are on and on-call rotation right now?
It used to be.
It used to be?
Mine is an unspoken on-call rotation.
Huh.
I'm always on call, but not like officially.
Yes. One of those?
Yes.
I was that one. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
I want about 10, but those are I set up myself.
That's right. Those are the demos you forget to take yourself out of. How many of you have been involved working on a major incident in the last month or two? One? Okay. So I'll tell you a little bit of a story. A few months ago, I was on call, and our on-call rotations are generally pretty quiet. They didn't used to be when we were in our colo facilities, but since we've moved to the cloud, everything has gotten a lot more stable, and on-call is usually a pretty peaceful week. I was getting ready to go to bed, got the page. So the first thing I did was acknowledge the page on my phone. Second thing I did was open up the Slack channel to see what was going on. And the last message in the Slack channel was the CEO saying, "Who's paging Doug Gorley?" So that raised my blood pressure a couple points. So very quickly, got on my laptop, got connected into our WebEx to find out what was going on. And it turned out that our RabbitMQ servers, which were kind of driving a lot of the traffic internally for our customers, were in a bad state, and they'd been that way for a while, longer than I'd like to admit. And there was a lot of people on this call. There were a number of engineers who were working on the Rabbit servers, trying to get them back up. And every time something was looking promising, it would fall apart once the traffic load picked up. And so things weren't happening. There was senior management on the call that wanted a better resolution than that. And as the person who had built out a lot of our failover infrastructure for our multi-region setup in the cloud, I was paged in there to help with our failover, because this wasn't something that we had to do since our migration into the cloud. So we got there, we got everyone back up and running. It wasn't real pretty, but it did highlight to me that we had two two separate approaches here where we were trying to fix forward for our stuff in the cloud, and we had a strategy that was maybe a little underdeveloped for how to fail over in the cloud. And so your options for what you can do in terms of fixing forward and failing over are really only as good as what you've developed before you're in the incident. That's a bit of what I want to talk about today. So first thing is what I would call the Anna Karenina principle of software deployments. So to paraphrase the Tolstoy book, all happy deployments are alike. Each unhappy deployment is unhappy in its own way. So if you are, hopefully it's a normal state of affairs for you that you're ready to deploy something to production. Your artifacts are built, they've gone through your testing process. You merge that to a deployment branch, or you trigger your CI/CD pipeline, and it takes those things, it pushes them into your production environment. They start serving traffic, and your customers are using them, they're happy, and everything's working. Hopefully, that's the way this goes most of the time for you. But when it doesn't, it can go bad in sort of unique and unpredictable ways. So a few examples of things that might go poorly when you are trying to deploy some sort of change into production. First one might be an upgrade to mutable architecture. So you've got an upgrade to your messaging bus like RabbitMQ or Kafka. These are running on VMs. You've upgraded the version, and all of a sudden your consumers can't get their messages. But those upgrades are done. You don't have a separate set of infrastructure there to fall back to. So you have to deal with whatever's going on in place. Another one might be changes to protocols and data formats. Maybe you've changed the way that your microservices are talking to each other, and it looks good. You roll it out at 4 o'clock because right before you go home is always the best time to deploy a change. Everything looks good overnight, and then in the morning, your East Coast customers come online at 6 a.m. Central Time, and all of a sudden you realize that under a real production load, you've got problems. Maybe there are some undersized components of your infrastructure for that size load. Maybe you've got some services that are only now engaging, and you're realizing that there's compatibility problems. But at this point, you're committed. You're hours into this deployment. You've got tens of thousands of transactions in this format, so you can't necessarily roll back. How are you going to deal with that one? And another one might be less technical, but it could be commitments that you have to customers. So maybe you've deployed a new change, and your customers are using that new functionality. You're finding a problem with it. It's destabilizing your environment. You want to roll it back. But your customers are dependent on this now, so fixing your problem is going to create new problems for them. What do you do with that? So ideally, to talk about my bias here a little bit, my opinion is that if you have the ability to roll back a change, you should choose that as your default strategy over fixing forward. That's more easy to do if the problem is isolated to a single service and your environment is relatively simple in those terms. That might look like running a rollback script if you've got a simple setup in your environment. Maybe your new component is running, the script is going to shut it down, reinstall the old one, start it back up, and you're serving traffic on your previous version. If you have a system that's going to support you having multiple versions installed in your production environment, maybe you can redirect traffic between them in a route back from the new version to the old version. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. And third, if you are deploying behind feature flags and this is isolated to a certain feature, maybe you can just disable that really easily and remove that functionality from all of your customers or from a single problem customer. That's going to give you a lot of granularity for how you deal with that situation.
But setting a feature flag, you have to think ahead, right? Sometimes they don't think ahead.
Absolutely. So setting a feature flag.
Okay, we set a feature flag. Then okay, we can fit a flag for
Yeah, setting a feature flag requires that you've planned for that, right? We were recently in a situation where I think we had to roll back a version of a component because somebody decided, oh, this is really simple functionality. We don't need a flag for this. Bottom line is use feature flags if you can. So talking about routing between different versions of your microservices, this is a simple example where we've got traffic coming in through a firewall and it lands at our load balancer. We've got a configuration database that is feeding the config for that load balancer. And as the load balancer routes traffic into our production environment where we've got some containerized systems, we've got some things running on VMs, and we've got some relational databases, we've got that configuration is saying for this customer, here are some different components that they're running, and here are the versions that you should route traffic to. And so what that means is that if we suddenly wanted to say, yeah, we're going to deploy our web UI version 3.0, and it blows up in our face, we don't have to go through a complicated orchestration to get back to our previous version. We just have to update this configuration database and redirect that traffic. So that's great if you can do it, but sometimes it's not as simple as that. Maybe the problem isn't isolated to a single service in your environment. Maybe you're seeing multiple services that are reporting errors and you can't quite pinpoint which one has gone wrong because they haven't been recently redeployed. Or maybe the problem isn't with something that's easily removable and redeployable, like Kafka RabbitMQ. So in that scenario, it's really useful if you have a secondary environment that you can run your traffic from. So this could be a second production environment where you are actively serving customer traffic from both of those. And then in the event of an issue in one of them, you reroute traffic for all of your customers to the other environment. Or it could be one that you use strictly for DR purposes, and you keep it scaled down when you're not using it, if that's an option for you, and then scale it up if you need to use it as a backup to get your traffic over. The benefit is that you get, well, maybe not complete depending on your setup, but you get a much greater level of isolation from whatever's going on in your failed production environment by operating on a completely different stack. The downside is it's costly because you need, maybe you need to be in a whole different cloud region and have a bunch of supporting infrastructure set up there. You might need a new second Kubernetes cluster, more database replicas. There's a lot that goes with that, but when you need it, it's very nice to have. So how you set this up isn't a big stretch from what we looked at for version routing. Again, we've got traffic coming in through our firewall, and our load balancer is reading some configuration, and then it's deciding whether to route your traffic to region A or to region B. And this is an extension on the version configuration that we looked at before. In this instance, we are actively serving traffic from two different regions. So Acme Co. is being served by the application stack in region A. The other guys are in region B. If region B had a failure, maybe it's at the cloud provider level. Maybe region B could be US East 1 for Google, and all of a sudden, all their VMs stop running. We could say, okay, we're going to fail them over to region A just by updating these values and serve their traffic from there. So I mentioned that you need to develop your options for how to do a rollback so that when you're in an incident, you have choices. One of them that we just talked about briefly is feature flags or feature toggles, if you're more familiar with that. It's a configuration setting that just controls whether or not a certain feature or component is available to a customer. This is what feature flags look like. This is from an older release of xMatters from August 2019. You see there's some features described here, and a big green button to turn them on and off. Also, it says inherited from global, which means we can drill down and do this at a per customer level. So if you want to read more about feature flags, have a look at featureflags.io. There's some good resources there. This doesn't have to be anything grand and complicated. I believe the setup that we have is built in-house, and it's a Cassandra database with a web UI and an API on top of it, because really all it is a bunch of toggles that are globally available. So having these feature flags allows you to do a few different things. If you deploy with all of your feature flags turned off, that would be a dark launch. So all of your functionality is out. You're running the new version, but all the good stuff in it, your customers don't see that yet. And the reason to do that is so that you can do a canary release where you gradually enable access to the new functionality so that you can detect problems early as a proverbial canary in the mine shaft and prevent causing a widespread problem for your customers. So here's what that might look like. You've got a new feature, it's gone through development, it's out in production, it's deployed, and you decide to start with, we're going to enable this for 10% of our customers. So 10% of our customer base is running the new version because we changed their version flags in our routing setup. And everything looks fine. Your error rates are stable. The rest of your infrastructure is performing as you expected. So you dial that up to 20%, and still everything is looking good. At 30%, you see two things. You see a bunch of 500 errors being returned to your customers through their API requests, and you see that your database response times have spiked. And so at that point, you roll it back to 20% and things stabilize, and that gives you the opportunity to step away, look at the code, and realize, oh, we've got a tight loop here where we keep querying the database, and we could be caching that data, but when we hit 30%, it started to impact our infrastructure. And so this gave you the ability to discover that before you really created an issue for customers. The impact was very small. Had you simply flipped a switch and let 100% of your customers onto this at once, you might have crippled your databases and things could have gone badly.
Yeah. Flash cuts, those are the best.
So if you take that principle of deploying things dark and then gradually turning it on, and we do it at the version level instead of at the feature level, then we're doing blue-green deployment. How many of you are familiar with that or do it? Yeah. Okay. So blue-green deployment is when we deploy our new version of the service and then gradually cut people over to it rather than doing this by flags. This is a screenshot from our Kubernetes GCP dashboard. So you can see, here's our web UI. We've got probably more of them than we need around. We don't have 6 failover targets. We probably have 1. But this is an example of these workloads that are running in our production environment. We're not just running the one that we're using right now. We have a previous version that is there, and all we would need to do to start using it would be to scale up the number of pods and then redirect the traffic to it. So you see that's the web UI deployment that we're currently using that ends in 651. This is an example that I took from our actual configuration database. You see there's the web UI version that's specified, 651. So if we were to just update those for all of our customers, that's a quick and easy operation that would shift many, many customers back with minimal disruption in our environment. So that's a lot of talk about how to roll back. The other option here is to fix something in place. If you're going to attempt to fix forward, there's some questions that you should ask. Number one, how severe is the impact of the incident that's going on right now? Are your customers experiencing an outage? It may be that you've got some really high-profile customers who can't use your system, and there's no tolerance to take the time to try to fix it in place when you have a viable rollback strategy. On the other hand, it may be that customers are having a partial outage, or it may be that this is off hours for most of your customers and people aren't really feeling the impact, or maybe it's internal tools that aren't impacting customers at all. In those cases, you probably have more leeway to try a fix forward approach than to pull the parachute and roll back. Another question is, do you really know what's broken? If you're dealing with this in a production environment, maybe you've just pushed a new version of your API service, and 5 minutes later it starts to fail, and you realize you've pushed it with some bad configuration. You've got the good configuration right there. It's quicker to push the new config and fix it than it is to go through a rollback process. That's a good example of when you might want to fix forward. On the other hand, if you're in that situation I described earlier where you're seeing multiple services that are coming up with errors and you don't really know where the problem is, you have to consider how long is it going to take you to get to a point where you can actually attempt to fix something. And if you do that, if you're piecing this together on the fly, how likely is it that that fix is actually going to resolve your issue? The config example, it's pretty good. If you're dealing with a software module that was added into your new service and there's something wrong in the code, but you don't quite know where, that's a lot less likely because you're trying to maybe fix code under pressure, maybe push something to production that is not thoroughly tested. And is there a risk that that could make your system worse? I think so. And then, as I kind of mentioned before, a lot of this comes down to time. How much time do you have? If you have developed good failback options, how long it takes to execute those is going to be pretty predictable. So whatever your SLOs are on those services may dictate whether you are able to attempt to fix forward. A few scenarios that might require you to take a fix forward approach instead of rolling back. One is if there is no rollback target available. So an example of that might be that you've done some updates to your database. In doing so, the old version of your database binaries aren't available anymore. You don't have replication targets that are on the old version. And now you run into a problem. You can't necessarily roll back your database upgrade, and you may need to deal with that in place. Another one might be if the software involves a backwards incompatible change. We use HashiCorp Console for service discovery in our environment. We recently did an upgrade from version 1.2 to 1.6. And I believe somewhere around version 1.4, there's a change in the Raft protocol that the console servers use to coordinate with each other, which meant that once we had introduced 1.6 servers into the cluster, we could have 1.2 and 1.6 in parallel, but we couldn't go back. We couldn't take those 1.6 servers out and go back to a 1.2 cluster because that protocol was upgraded across the board, and the old servers wouldn't have continued to do what we needed them to do. So that's another scenario where you might be stuck with a fix forward approach. And another one might be if your rollback is going to have a cascading impact on other services. Rolling back one service is great, but if you've got a network of dependencies where rolling back that service means that there are other services that need to be rolled back to a previous version to talk to it, and we don't know how deep that rabbit hole goes, that may be complicated and may introduce extra risk and instability into your environment. And you may not be willing to put together that rollback. So to pivot a little bit here, regardless of which strategy you're using, if you're fixing forward or rolling back, you want to have a plan for that going into your incident. So having an incident strategy is a really good thing, so that you're not having to try to figure all this out on the fly and guess about which way you're going to go. A few things that you should do. when putting together that plan, you should know who's in charge. I've been on some incidents where it wasn't clear who had the authority to make decisions that were going to impact customers. And so we're good at that now. We've got an incident command process and incident commanders identified. It's easy to get an incident commander involved in an incident, but that's something that you need to have so that you know who's calling the shots. And how do you get the right people involved? So if you have an on-call rotation that'll page out an engineer to look at a problem, that's great. As the incident escalates, you might need a network engineer, a DBA, a developer who works on that service. You might need customer support involved. And if this is happening at 2 in the morning, all those people are probably not just sitting at their computers waiting for you to ping them on Slack. So how do you get those people involved in your incident quickly so that you have all the right people there to choose the right strategy and address the problem? And coming back to time again, how long can you afford to attempt to fix forward? This is something that, depending on your organization, you may build into your incident management plan. We have a couple of time thresholds from when the clock starts ticking on an incident to when we begin preparing for a failover to when we actually execute that failover to get our customers cut over to a separate environment. And we do that so that we don't have an optimistic view of fixing the problem doesn't skew us towards, well, let's just try this one more thing, and well, this looks good. Let's keep working on this. And before you know it, you're 90 minutes into an incident where people have good ideas about how to fix the problem, but really you should have failed over an hour ago. If you want more information on incident response, Google's SRE workbook is really good. I would recommend checking it out. And so the last thing I would say here is whatever your strategies are, document them in runbooks for how to deal with these processes. Sounds like something everybody does. Everybody documents everything they do, right? And it's always super easy to find right when you need it. But having the discipline there to actually do that and have that information available for how, and if you include information about what a fix forward might look like for a service and what a rollback might look like for a service, that's going to help people dealing with that incident, especially if they're not the expert on that service. So here's an example of a runbook for Rabbit. It says RabbitMQ clients are unable to connect. There's some diagnostic information here to help you identify that, yes, this is what I'm seeing, so this is the runbook I should be working from. Some subject matter experts listed, so you know who you need to get involved in the incident. Some steps to try to remediate it that are documented really simply so that either the new guy on your team who's never really worked with this before can handle it, or you can handle it at 3 in the morning when you're only halfway awake. And then, if possible, and if it suits your environment, instructions on how to roll that back. Mm-hmm. So here's an example where maybe we are just submitting a HTTP request to our customer configuration system that posts a new version of that service. And if it's as simple as that, then great, we can easily redirect traffic away from it. So just a few takeaways. Understand the implications of your different strategies. There are definitely some benefits to rolling back. There are times when you may want to fix forward, excuse me. So how detrimental is downtime in your system? How disruptive is rolling back a deployment? This may vary greatly even within your organization and definitely across different kinds of systems. Developing your rollback options, so using feature flags if that's an option, having a blue-green deployment strategy, all of those things are going to make your life easier if you have to roll back in an incident, and having a plan for how you're going to deal with those incidents when you're in the thick of it so that you're not trying to figure it out as you go. Questions, comments, arguments?
So what do you do in a situation where it's hardware related, right? That's causing your problem. You don't have something you can fail over too quickly. It's not software, right? Like, do you have a run? Do you make a run book for that kind of situation? Because like, there's probably an infinite number of possibilities.
Yeah, it's a good question. So ideally, if you know that hardware failure is a risk, you've got some sort of risk mitigation strategy to deal with that. Maybe you've got another hardware stack in another geographic region that you can fail over to. If you don't, and this is something that's going to cripple your customer traffic, you probably have no option but to fail forward, and you probably need to think carefully about how you're going to communicate that to your customers, because if it's a hardware failure, some of this is going to look a little different, I guess. You might be trying to get hardware vendors on the phone very quickly to get in and swap out something in a rack.
Your Dell SLAs for how quickly you get an engineer show up with a new hard drive or whatever, right?
Yeah, and you're going to have to factor that into your SLAs with your customers, right? If your ability to respond under those circumstances is only as fast as your hardware vendors can respond, then that should probably be reflected in what you're promising to customers.
You mentioned triage, and you showed a rotten book. Have any opinions on setting up like automation and triage for recovery, for alarms or alerts or whatever in your system?
Do I have any opinions about it?
Yeah.
I think, so triaging, you said triaging alerts and alarms. So what does that look like to you?
Okay, so one company I worked for, T-Mobile, we had our NOC, where I helped build a system. We did alarm triage, and so there's network nodes that are out there that are firing off alarms to our admin console, and we're picking those alarms up and we're seeing what it is. And so what we did was we created an automated script type process that would do SSH and go out to the nodes and determine what the problems are. We'd have hardware checks and physical and software and communication and whatever. We'd run those things in an automated script, and then a report would come back and we format it in HTML and bring it up on the admin console so they could read it and see.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just one approach to do alarm triage, and then the runbook would support with some types of buttons to say, okay, the first option to resolve this problem is this. They push that button and then go, okay, well, we'll shut the system down for 5 minutes and bring it back up, let it cool down. If it was like overheating or something. So in a sense, it's like taking another step forward. In those instances, you have to have that like in telecommunications systems, because 911 server goes down, what happens? People die.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of scenarios that I had worked with in the past. And I was just wondering, xMatters, do they have that kind of provisioning capabilities?
I think Tim could probably speak pretty well to that.
Well, and the funniest thing is that you said this is an example, in your example, when you were working for T-Mobile, right?
Mm-hmm.
How long ago was that?
Oh, a few years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
T-Mobile's now our customer, and that's what they use xMatters for, to do exactly that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, it's probably under a different product.
Actually, he explained everything.
Right. So, but that's exactly
Resolve is the product that they use.
What's the name of the product?
It's called Resolve. Yeah, it's based out in Washington, I think it is. They have an office here in Frisco.
Okay.
Yeah, it was client server type based product.
Okay.
And pretty much it would monitor your systems.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know how much it has like trickled down into different areas, and whatnot. But yeah, I mean that's the obviously we recommend using those types of capabilities, right? If you can triage, if you can collect data from other sources to help inform you about what's going on, that's going to provide greater context. It's going to eliminate a lot of things. It's going to automate like the first couple steps that you would normally go through to kind of query different systems to figure out what's going on. If you can automate that, then that just helps provide you better context to make better decisions quicker, right? So that's what, I mean, from our perspective, that's one of the key capabilities of the xMatters tool, is it allows you to do that. But obviously, yeah, if there's, if you can identify if there's an issue and if there's a failure that occurs, the first three things I'm going to do are always go check my queues, right? Or then go look at the recent build, but if there's some standard things you're always going to go to, then if you can script that in a way that, as soon as the alert happens, that's already been done, it's already fed you the data that you would need to look, and that just eliminates the time you need to go look up those things, right?
It also helps develop the options. So based on that information that's collected, here's the things that you're most likely to do, and put those options in front of the engineer who's on charge or on call, so that they can potentially do that right from their phone.
If you have the capability to then sort of dynamically configure the response options based on the information that's been retrieved, right? So let's say that you go do that triage, it pulls back information that shows the fact that there was a recent push, there was a recent deployment, right? Then you might dynamically configure the option to roll that back, right? But let's say that the code hasn't been pushed in, I don't know what, a normal time frame would be, but let's say nothing's been updated for months, and then clearly that's not, that hasn't happened. And so rolling back the most recent deployment isn't going to do anything. But there might be other things that you've detected as part of that triage. Then you can dynamically provide just like different types of remediation, capabilities or options. And so again, depending on whatever tool you're using, or what script you're using, if you can dynamically determine what those next steps might be based on the data you've retrieved, then again, that helps the engineer just know what to do, right? Instead of being presented with an option of 20 different things, it's like, okay, we've eliminated 10 or 12 of those based on the data we've retrieved. And so now it's really one of these 3 or 4 things we would do next, hopefully. And so if you can determine that, if you're using a tool that has capabilities to do that, then obviously that's going to make the process easier.
Yes. Okay. So quick plug. Tim just gave a great explanation of what our product does. So I won't belabor it too much here. One more thing I would point out is if you're interested in trying that out, go to xmatters.com/free, sign up for a free account for xMatters, and have a look at how it might help you deal with the kind of incidents we've been talking here today.
Yeah, that was one of the things, again, we were kind of talking about it before we came in, but we are dedicated to the DevOps space and to help further the technology in this space. And so we've made our platform completely free for small teams up to 10 users. So that way most DevOps pods have a small team, and you can completely automate your on-call rotations as well as your triage, remediation steps, all the things we've been talking about with a tool like this. It's completely free forever, unlimited integrations, and it gives you the ability to really drastically improve your response times, your MTTA, MTTR, those types of things, and to do it all without having to worry about trying to go requisition funds for something like that, which is kind of sometimes is the most difficult thing. Like, you have a problem, you want to go fix it. There are tools that are available. If I have to go find budget somewhere to get it done, that's a whole different problem that I want to deal with. If I can just go get a free tool that works for me and my team, I'll just use it, right?
So what languages are the tools written in?
What language are they written in?
Yeah, so like you want to integrate with existing
So
systems?
integrations. So the backend code might be different, but the tool has a built-in integration library and a built-in interface for integrating with any other tools you might want to work with. So anything that's capable of sending or receiving a REST API, we can integrate with, or email. You can use that as a trigger. Essentially, most of our integrations are done through REST APIs, and then taking a JSON payload and converting it into whatever I need to, whatever format I want to use to work with. But fortunately, what we've done is we've gone through and built an integration library that has the vast majority of all the different tools that you might want to work with in the space. And we've built either fully baked in integrations where you just turn it on, it's already in the system, or we've already got like a pre-built zip file that you can say, hey, it's not just a flag you turn on the product, but download this communication plan, install it, and that provides you everything on the xMatters side, and then here's the steps 1 through 10 that you need to do on your, the opposite tool to configure it. But essentially just webhooks that fire that we receive, and then we receive the data and then transform it in some way, and then responds in kind. We have 4 tools that don't have a web services interface that aren't exposed to the internet. We also have an agent that you can just put on any machine. That agent's capable of running anything, shell scripts, your command line, whatever you might want to do, which is what we use for a lot of legacy applications that don't have a web services front end, that don't have a REST API capability, you need to do some things. It also allows you to, since xMatters is a completely cloud product, allows you to work with tools that aren't exposed to the internet or applying that way.
Great.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.